The Lost Year, Chapter 3, Old Homes. Sire, Leon said, gently pushing the door open. The room was spotless, and Arthur looked peeved about it. He was currently digging through one of his wardrobes. He was still in his sleep shirt. His breakfast lay half-eaten on one of the tables. Yes, Leon, what can I do for you? He snapped, tossing aside a shirt. Leon raised an eyebrow. Are you well? He asked, and Arthur frowned. I cannot find the shirt I want. Whoever cleaned in here last has moved everything from where it belongs. Arthur said, slamming down another shirt. Leon bit back a small smile. Merlin had been gone for near 2 weeks now, and Arthur had been, for lack of a better word, grumpy for a solid week. Sire, there's news from a few villages bordering Estir, Leon said, holding up the scroll in his hand. Arthur looked up, something like hope in his eyes. Well, what does it say? He asked, snatching up a shirt at random and stepping behind the changing screen. Leon stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He didn't need to unroll the scroll to know what it said. He'd already read it, but knew that this news would require written proof. Sire, there's been a quake near the ridge of Estir a week or so ago, if the reports are correct. Several villages had houses collapse, only minor injuries luckily, but the pass of Estir was struck with an avalanche caused by the quake. It's impassable, Leon said, and Arthur stepped out from behind the screen, shirtless, and snatched the scroll from him. He read it through quickly, and Leon could see his mood sour with every word. Ealdor lies beyond the ridge of Estir. Has there been any word from Merlin at all? Arthur asked. Leon shook his head. Arthur swore. We have no easy way of contacting Estir. Without the pass, it would take a week, maybe 2, to get around the mountains. Leon informed Arthur, though he likely already knew that. When do we think the pass will clear? Arthur asked. It was early spring, and the weather had been warm. Leon shrugged. If the weather holds, a month. Maybe more, he said, shaking his head. Arthur sighed and flopped down in one of the chairs. You miss her, don't you? He asked quietly. Arthur glanced up at the door to ensure Leon had closed it, then nodded. I hate to think of her suffering through losing her mother alone, he admitted. I would have gone with her, he said, sadness in his voice. Leon frowned. The circumstances happened too fast for her to actually inform anyone, Leon reminded him. Arthur nodded. The way she was writing, she would likely have reached Ealdor long before the quake, so there's no danger she was in the pass when it happened, he tried to reassure, knowing there was only a grain of truth in his words. If Merlin had been coming home, back to Camelot, at the time of the quake, Leon didn't want to think about that possibility. Despite all of Merlin's adventures all over Camelot, she had never been this way before. The mountains of Isgard lay beyond the ridge of Cymrae, where Merlin had once been held captive under the guise of Lady Morgana, but she'd never been beyond it. It seemed Hengist's fortress had long been abandoned, likely after he died at the teeth of his own wildren. She and Arthur had cut into Estir long before these mountains, when they went searching for Balinor the first time. If he hadn't pointed it out, Merlin would likely never have noticed the fortress tucked up on the edge of the mountain. It looked as though the halls had been carved out of the mountainside itself, and Merlin couldn't help but stare. It's a bit impressive, Balinor said with a small smile. It was carved with magic, so those who were kin of dragonkind could live with the dragons. This is why Uther had to lure the dragonlords out. Unless you know where you're going, the fortress is impregnable, Balinor said, dismounting as they reached the bottom of the cliff face where the fortress was carved. That's amazing, Merlin said, and followed her father's lead, hopping off her horse and leading Dancer up to the cliff. Balinor reached a large stone and spoke. The words were in the same guttural language he'd used to call the dragon, but the words were different. He did not call the dragon. but spoke to the wall, which shimmered, and the stone vanished, revealing an archway large enough for them to guide both horses through. That's why he could never breach it. You need to know the dragon tongue to enter the fortress. Merlin marveled, and Balinor nodded. Exactly. Come, I have much to show you, Balinor said, leading his horse into the opening. Merlin followed, surprised that light never stopped, even as the rock reformed behind them. In fact, the light grew brighter as they stepped into what appeared to be a stone stable. It was abandoned, but plants and grass could not be held back by the magic that protected this place. They stabled the horses, letting them graze, as Balinor pointed up the staircase. Merlin pointed to the crystals on the wall. What are they? Fire is not always the best choice of light source. The horses we once kept here had a healthy fear of it, as the younger dragons tended to chase them for fun, Balinor said, a sadly nostalgic smile on his face. Further up, we use torches. These crystals are rare and hard to mine. They react to the presence of magic. Balinor explained, and Merlin nodded as he led the way up the stairs. She took a torch off the wall and lit it with a wave of her hand. Did Gaius teach you to do that? Cast without speaking? No, I've been doing it since I was a child. My mother told me. Her eyes slid down to the floor. She told me the story of your birth, Balinor said as he continued up the stairs. Do you know what the bird was? The one that called you to life? He asked, and Merlin shook her head. No, Mother. She always thought the gods had sent it as a mercy, Merlin said, staring around as the stairs opened up into a large room, not unlike the banquet hall of Camelot. But the decorations here were all based around dragons. They climbed in stone up and around the pillars here and flew through paintings faded with time. She likely wasn't wrong. The gods do not often make their will known, but I believe at least one goddess did that day, Balinor said, setting his bag down in the chamber. Merlin followed his lead, and he nodded to another door. He pushed it open, and Merlin gasped. Inside was the largest collection of books she had ever seen in her life, including the library at Camelot. They were covered in 20 years' worth of dust. Balinor rolled up his sleeves as Merlin spotted a brazier and lit it with a wave of her hand. Let's see what we can find to help you in your destiny, he said, and Merlin smiled, placing her torch in an empty sconce on the wall and hugging her father.